thank you, Olly, for joining me today for the International Day of Multilingualism. Great to have you here.
Thanks so much. It's always a pleasure and a privilege.
Well, the pleasure and the privilege is all mine today because I get to speak to lots of people about my favorite topic, languages and multilingualism. So I'm extremely happy I'm in my element and can't think of a better way to spend a Saturday, to be honest.
Yeah,
So
indeed.
here I am. And I mean, people may not know this about us because people see obviously what happens and they know the community is linked and then we know we all know each other. But you and I have been on quite a journey with this whole language learning thing from when we first met, haven't we? We met in Berlin, right?
In person for the first time, yeah. I mean, I think we probably knew each other online before that, like as is often the case. But yeah, I remember us meeting in Berlin, probably 2014, some time ago now.
Yeah, it's a while ago. And I remember that meeting in person particularly because we went through some really interesting experiences listening to different talks. And I remember particularly the talk on synesthesia and how people have synesthesia as part of their learning process, seeing sounds and seeing sounds in colors and tasting them and experiencing them in sort of different shapes. How did you feel? I mean, because we talked about it afterwards, but sort of, did that just sort of make your mind blow as it did mine when?
So this was a totally new topic for me. And just to contextualize this for people, this is 2014, a beautiful like late spring day in Berlin. We were on like the fifth or sixth floor rooftop terrace, me, you, and Dom, I believe it was.
Yeah.
And then we all had a beer in our hand, and it was just relaxing at the end of the day. And then I think me and you were talking about something, some idea for a society of some kind. That's how clearly I remember it. And then Dom comes, and Dom has synesthesia, and we began talking about it. And this was, I think I'd heard the term before, but I'd never related it to language learning. And so we, as I remember, stood out there on this terrace for the best part of an hour or so or more talking about this. And I just remember listening so intently to the passion and the intensity with which Dom described synesthesia, seeing things not as words but as colors, and thinking, wow, I mean, this is the world. You know, but kind of previously, my relationship with language learning was a very personal one. I knew what languages meant to me, but it wasn't until I started coming to these events, meeting people like you, meeting people like Dom, and discovering these areas like synesthesia that I realized, wow, this is a very big world out there, and it means so many people have different experiences, identify with languages in different ways, and the opportunity to actually come together in these forums, like at the gathering, like at the Polyglot conference, and like at the Polyglot workshops, which I think we'll talk about later. For so many people, it's such an important thing in their lives, because it's a way to take something that is very personal,
Yeah,
and then to share it with the world and discover other people like them.
Yeah, I think this is the thing, is it really opened up a completely different dimension to you sitting at home, you learn your languages, you hear about other people who learn languages, they may do slightly different things, but coming together, there's something about coming together in a space and sharing stories and sometimes quite personal things about the stories as well that you don't get always, or you didn't at that time in the online context. It would be very much a lot more clinical, and this is kind of where things started to change. And I remember, you know, we'd go to these talks about people doing different things with different languages, and the focus would always be on different aspects, whether it was pronunciation, writing, reading, if they were introvert, extrovert, what kind of backgrounds they all had, because everyone had different backgrounds. And I think this is probably where it all the whole idea as well for doing these polyglot workshops came about, right? This idea of everyone's got these questions. They all have different ways of doing it. How do you give advice that's not generic. And this is where you, Alex, and I we started doing this polyglot workshops in person, talking to people about what their real struggles were. And this for me was a game changer. And I remember you coming into your element because you obviously have this great background in the British Council as well. So you had this teaching background. You knew how to do this and how to structure it. What were your thoughts when we started doing it? And how the people reacted?
So I think you hit the nail on the head with your first question, which was, how do you structure workshops for people who come from such different backgrounds and are looking for such different things? And to be honest with you, I don't know what you think about this, but I'm not sure we entirely figured that out over the course of these workshops, because we ran a lot of them, and you and Alex have done more than me in different places as well, before and subsequently. And because I was thinking about this before the call today, and I was thinking about the conversation that the three of us had, and there was a particular tension which we needed to resolve. And this is the thing which I'm not sure we did resolve. And hey, we should reform and try and resolve it. But the tension is that on the one hand, you have different types of people who want to come to these workshops. And for people who don't know what these workshops were basically the chance to spend a couple of days. They were usually 2 days long, I think, with the three of us, and we kind of build it as, learn direct from us, how we learn languages. But so I think the first workshop we did, it was quite structured, and it was, okay, here's grammar, here's vocabulary, here's, what you might expect. But then what we found was that the same people would come back to the second event and the third event, because we often ran them in London. Yeah. And so what do you do when you have the same people coming back again? Because you can't just you can't repeat the same workshop. You can't stick on the same topics. And so we ended up morphing away from, hey, here's how we learn languages, to let's kind of take a series of vignettes about what it means to learn languages and to present those in the workshops. The difficulty is, though, that that's fantastic for your kind of repeat attendees. Mm-hmm. But then for people who are coming for the first time, a lot of the time, there's a certain kind of person who comes to these workshops who's kind of thinking, hey, just tell me what you do. Give me your strategy. Give me your techniques. And so we've got to balance the method, the kind of how-to, with the stuff that I think for us is probably more meaningful, which is like, what's our relationship with languages on a daily basis? What does it mean to have a multilingual life? And what are the different issues to think about? And so this is the challenge, which from workshops for me, which is the most interesting and also the hardest challenge. Yeah, is that something that you remember or recognize?
Yeah, I mean, it was always interesting to see how different people took to it. And I think one of the things that I noticed was there was a kind of a community almost around the workshops, almost like a mini conference where you would sort of shoot the breeze and talk about languages. And I think, like every human being as well, you can structure things to a certain degree, but some of the ad lib stuff, some of the things that we would just say off the cuff, would be different, because the stories wouldn't be the same each time, because you'd want to explore different stories. Naturally, you think, oh, I'm repeating myself, I want to explore other stories. And there was certainly, when you see the same faces in some of the workshops, you definitely felt that desire to adapt slightly so that it wasn't the same thing. I'm not sure the people that came for more than one workshop actually came more for the language learning aspect, but more for the motivation of being in a group. Yeah. And getting things done. So my main takeaway was, people need that community to sort of reflect back on, and to keep them going, to sort of pace themselves, as like you may have a trainer at the gym. It's not kind of a finished thing just because you've done it once and you've been told how to do it. It's definitely this idea of a coach. And I think those sessions were sometimes for some people more a coaching session, and reaffirming what you're doing. And psychologically, I think for learners, and I find this myself as well, that with Korean now, if I didn't have my study group on Clubhouse, I don't know how successful I would be with my studies in Korean. Because it's the community, it's just, you get a lot from it, you get a lot of energy from them.
Well, that's it. And I think that I see. I don't when I think about the guests who would come frequently. I mean, you know, we know who they are. They're extremely accomplished polyglots who would attend these, and we would people who we would consider as peers, rather than students. And you know, if I'm thinking from their perspective, I doubt very much that they are coming thinking, okay, I'm going to learn something new today. That's not really the mindset. Because I think the real special thing about these events, where they really come to life, it's in the breaks, it's at lunch, it's at dinner afterwards, and often, you know, you kind of we may have a structured session which could be about I don't know, approaches to learning vocabulary, and it might be the case that people don't necessarily learn anything new, but just hearing someone else's perspective and the way that they organize their thinking around that topic actually gives you a kind of framework to bounce off and clarify your own ideas. And then it's kind of at drinks afterwards when you said, oh, you know, when you said that made me think about this. And then getting to spend the time together is kind of where the real value is. And I think there's a parallel there with conferences. You know, many people who are regulars at conferences take the approach of, sure, I'm going to the talks, but I'm really here for the community and to see old friends and things like that. But you know, there was one moment that really stuck out to me from all the workshops we did, which was, and this was, I think it may have been the last one that we did, and it was, and I remember specifically thinking about what session I wanted to run, what the topic was that I wanted to cover. And I kind of went out on a limb a little bit because I knew that people would be expecting something more structural, like, you know, how do you learn two languages at the same time, or that kind of thing. But I decided to talk about the psychological element, the psychological battles that you face when speaking languages with people. And I don't know if you remember this session, but I talked about a kind of an anecdote of when I was many years ago when I was learning Japanese, and I met a friend here in London. I say here in London, I don't live in London anymore, but still in London. And we kind of went out for drinks one evening, and she would just insist on speaking English. We're all familiar with this struggle. And I just told the story of how, and I was kind of pushing to keep the conversation in Japanese, but just how I wasn't in a great mood. I felt kind of low energy, and I just gave up and I resigned. And basically for the rest of the night, I just said, you know what, I'm just going to talk English. And so something that I'd gone out to in order to practice Japanese became just me sitting there rather grumpily speaking English. And it was just this simple anecdote. But one of the women who was at the workshop came up to me afterwards in tears and said, you know, that story that you told, this happens to me all the time. And I thought I was the only one who suffered from this. I thought this was something that was unique to me, and I never understood why it was happening. But thank you for expressing this, because now I realize that I'm not alone, and this is a natural part of the learning. And that just stuck with me and really made me realize that just how important community and the opportunity to talk with people about different factors and different facets of their experience with languages, just how important that is and how valuable that is. And to the extent that we can offer that forum to people is extremely valuable, much more than I had initially realized.
Yeah, I think you're right. And Ron actually just wrote now in the chat that often a slightly new way to see things is also very valuable. Sometimes it may be that you have a similar idea, but if you just frame it in a different way, use a story, use an anecdote that helps to sort of slide things along a little bit, and then all of a sudden it clicks and you're like, oh, now I know why it wasn't working. I'm not alone in this. It does happen to me too. And I think, like you say, a lot of people came to the events around the world, and many knew all about all of these techniques and tricks and tips about how to learn languages. Some people came and they wanted to learn multiple languages and were interested in that area. And sometimes it was difficult to sort of to balance. You know, you don't want to make people think that everyone has to learn lots and lots of languages, otherwise it's not valid. Learning your first language is always good, right? And multiple, when we talk about multilingualism, we're talking about many languages as well, and many different languages, and the techniques that you use for one language may be very different to another as well. And have you found with your studying and the questions we got during the polyglot workshops, anything that sort of sticks out with sort of how you tackled, for example, Japanese as opposed to Arabic, as opposed to Portuguese and Spanish?
Well, the thing that I struggle with personally is my relationship with languages through different periods of my life. And this is it's a classic example, really, of you know, for example, someone coming to a workshop with a very unique circumstance, very unique relationship with language. But it's not not a one-dimensional thing. Like it's really not a question of how do I get from intermediate French to advanced French? It's not that. You have to consider these things in terms of someone's particular situation in life and the season of life they're going through. And this is the thing that I struggle with the most, because a lot of my kind of most prolific language learning happened when in my 20s, and I'd travel around a lot. I'd meet so many people from different countries, have these big friendship groups, and it was really, I was just reveling in the joy of meeting new people and discovering new cultures, learning new languages. But then and it was quite pure in that sense, so I could easily sit down for hours and study, and then go out in the evening, spend time with people, and then my languages would just kind of blossom over time. But as I got older, it really, really changed. And so when I went to live, I spent many years abroad and living in the Middle East, learning Arabic, and then I'm living in Japan, learning Japanese. It was a very different thing for me, because it wasn't just about the language. It was also about kind of feeling happy and feeling and fitting in the place that I was living. And so I was having to discover a kind of new way to approach languages within that new context that I was in. And I couldn't do what I'd done before to learn earlier languages. And then now things have changed again. So now my life is totally different. I'm living in the countryside in the southwest of England. Wonderful area, but fairly isolated. And so I don't have a lot of contact with people. And and now my main focus is on work and on family and on just enjoying life. And languages are, they play a different role in my life now. And so I don't really think of it in terms of, the specific techniques that I may have used 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. They still work now, obviously. It's just that I may not want to do them anymore. I may not want to do that thing anymore, because actually learning a language means a different thing. So I find my approach to language learning changing. And one of the reasons that I in my own work, I work a lot with stories and promote immersion and input, is because I've kind of realized that the relationship that I want to have with languages right now, especially in the context of COVID and lockdown, where we're not, we don't have much human interaction. The relationship that I want with languages is one where they can bring me joy and fulfillment on a daily basis, whatever it is that I'm doing. And often that means, watching movies or reading books and things like that. So I'm kind of focusing on that as a source of as an approach to learning that can work anywhere. But I wouldn't have done that, I don't think, when I was 21, because I was just obsessed with meeting people, and so it really does. I find it a moving target and very difficult to pin down. I think it's just one of the reasons that everything has to be seen through the lens of each individual person and where they are in life and what they want to achieve.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting actually that you say that, because sometimes we think that we should be able to do things as we did in our youth. And I think, when you think about school and, oh, but I managed to learn that really quickly and I did that in a different way. Yeah, but what was your set of circumstances at that stage? Did you have the same things on your plate? And these are really, really interesting and important considerations, I think, for anyone learning a language or learning anything generally. I think that, also learning your first language and then learning your fifth language is a different experience. It depends on which language it is, where you are in your life, and like you say, taking a look at the moving target and knowing how to adapt. And do you think that, during the workshops, I know we talked a lot about there's no one way to do it, and we tried to sort of appease people with there are some things you can do. Which of these small things that you can do you think really do travel well across time and space and across languages and situations?
What a question. I mean, the question is, how do you learn languages, right?
Well, no, I'm not gonna ask something as sort of blatant as that. I think more little things that people may not think of doing that are tips that sort of stand the test of time. I think how to incorporate languages into your life, because I think how to learn a language, I will teach you a language, or that's a more general question, right?
Mm.
Whereas how you incorporate things, little tricks and tips that you've picked up over the years and things that we've passed on to the people from the workshops, there are things that we do to incorporate language into our lives, because I think that's what we all agree on. If you
Yeah.
don't have any if you don't incorporate the language at all in your life, it's not going to seep into your skin through osmosis if you don't touch the language at all. But how do you actually get that contact?
Yeah. Well, I hope I can do this question justice. Um, I I think there are a set of principles, and you can really only talk in terms of principles, I think. And one of those principles, for example, is daily contact and creating daily contact in the language through whatever means. And it can be anything that suits you. It could be through reading, it could be through speaking. But daily contact is one of those conditions that you really have to have in order to advance. So daily contact is one of those things. I think community is one of those things as well, because um, community is one of the things that can have the most impact on motivation. So if you think that, if you think about what does this relate to, so daily contact really just relates to creating the opportunity and the conditions to learn. So if you have daily contact with the language, then you have the conditions where learning can take place, right? Where you can learn new vocabulary, where you can notice new facets about the language. So it's the opportunity to learn and to notice things. Community for me is about motivation, and it's about, we were talking about this offline the other day about how you were struggling in a certain phase of your career, and you rekindled that passion through community, because
Yeah.
that gave you the kind of the reason why. So you've got community that kind of fosters motivation, and then
Picking up a short stories every now and again and dipping into it.
well, I'm all for that. I'm all for picking up short stories. Yeah, but I think this comes back really to the concept of daily contact. I mean, certainly for me, the one of the one of the patterns that I see more and more, the bigger that my platform gets, the more people that I get to interact with, I feel that availability of material is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, which is a kind of funny thing, because in a way you'd think that the internet, certainly the kind of, the narrative of the internet is that the internet makes everything available, it solves all problems. But in a way, it kind of creates the paradox of choice. And now that you have YouTube and anything you want on Google and Clubhouse, there's so much stuff out there. But I see people getting very hung up on on material, and finding material that they feel is suitable for them to learn. And people will people will feel, okay, I should be able to watch these YouTube videos and understand them, but then they try and then they don't, and then so they pick up a book and they think, okay, I should be able to learn through this, but then it's too hard and they can't. I, I think that the availability of material is a big issue, and so relating this back to your question, I find myself encouraging people more and more to take as much time as they need to actually find that material that is appropriate for them, and they're going to find motivating, because as soon as you've got that, then studying just becomes a natural consequence of that. So yeah, those are a few things that I think you really can take with you anywhere. It's the daily contact with the language, with suitable material and a community of people to keep you motivated. I'm not sure how coherent a list that is, but there's a few things that come to mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And Ron's agreeing. He's saying, accessibility of materials at the right level and exactly suitable materials for what you're doing. And so it's not ridiculously advanced, or it's not also ridiculously easy. You're also feeling challenged, and you're learning something from it, right? It's that can definitely be
Yeah, and I think this relates to different learners in different ways. So, a lot of the time when we're speaking in terms of principles, or even more specifically in terms of language learning tactics, highly experienced language learners can listen to that and think, and pick holes in it. But the reality is that the experienced language learners who have been around the block a few times can make anything work. They can pick up things at different levels and make it work because they know how they learn. But I don't know. Certainly, in what I do, I don't see the big impact that I can have really in helping people who are already experienced language learners, because it's such a personal game. Once you know how you learn, there's a kind of limited utility to external advice. But the vast majority of all language learners are still picking up their first language and still trying to get to grips with their first language. And so I feel that that's where we can have the biggest impact, is by taking people from 0 to 10 rather than from 90 to 100.
Absolutely. And I think we've when we were doing the polyglot workshops, obviously it was a while ago now, and technology's moved on. I mean, you mentioned Clubhouse, and that's where I'm doing my study groups, and people who are sort of used to learning lots of languages can find study groups, can find conversational partners, can find interest groups through that language on applications like Clubhouse, or on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, on YouTube even. And you can sort of listen to materials that people are putting out, interact with people in the comments, even on TikTok as well. There's a growing community of people producing materials on TikTok and in different languages. And I think now what I always say to people, and I wrote a blog post about this a while ago, when I was saying, how do I incorporate a language like Korean into my life? Because we have like 0 Koreans in the Balkans. I think we just really don't have any Koreans.
Is it really literally 0? I would have thought you would have had a few.
I've met one. I'm not going to
local restaurateurs or something.
I've met one. But she speaks Macedonian, and she speaks English as well. And I think I normally speak when I've not seen her around for a few years, but she had children here. She was married to a Macedonian man. But generally in my life, I don't really come across Korean. And so I had to think out of the box. How am I going to do this? How do I get it? And I thought, well, what's the thing I do that's sort of the path of least resistance? And it's probably this little thing here, my phone, because I always check my social media. I always check, what's going on. And so I just found 12 or so, probably following about more like 20 now, different Korean language teachers, language learners on Instagram. And I follow them, and they put materials out, and without even making any effort whatsoever, I'm confronted with Korean on a daily basis. And I do a similar thing on Twitter, and I try on Facebook, not so much, but on those two particularly, and then also on Clubhouse now with the study group. And I find that's a really good way to just naturally have this. I mean, this isn't something we could share back then in the same way as we can now. I think things have developed and come on a lot more, probably will in the future. Talking about that, for my final part of this, and before we get to some questions, where do you see things going moving forward?
I'm pretty old school. I'm a natural skeptic of technology, which I know is not very trendy. And but I kind of, what they say about warfare. They say like the next war will be a nuclear war, but then the war after that will be fought with sticks and stones and spears. I I kind of hope, I would like to see language learning go back to its roots, because I find myself more and more I find myself getting more and more off put. No, what's the right word? I find the development of technology, as wonderful as it is, I find more and more off putting, because I just find I don't like the way that my attention is just getting split a million different ways. I find that really, really problematic, and I'm conflicted, because on the one hand, it's fantastic how much, for all the huge reel of access to content that you just laid out, and the fact that you can get access to content in so many different platforms in so many different ways. I think that's wonderful, and it can only be a positive. And yet, I feel that language learning is really a matter of focus, and I'm a skeptic when it comes to social media in particular, and how that relates to how that adds to or detracts from focus. And then, ultimately it's all down to us as individuals and how we manage that. But I think that things are going to keep developing, and the conversations that I have with friends and colleagues of mine in the kind of online language space, more and more the conversations are about AI, they're about machine learning, and people who are, it's not the case. I think it probably was at some point, but it's not just the case that you've kind of got these tech people in Silicon Valley that are imposing AI on everyone else, whether they like it or not. There are very smart people in the language community who are wholly embracing AI for a whole bunch of different purposes. An idea I heard recently, who was I forget who was telling me about this, but the idea of AI for speaking practice, so that a bot essentially who can listen to what you're saying and offer corrections. I mean, we kind of, things like Facebook bots and things came around a few years ago, and they were just awful, and made the world a worse place. But I think that's just like version 1, right? The next iteration that I can see. I mean, how cool would it be if there is a kind of bot of some kind where you could practice speaking Korean, and if you made a mistake, it would correct you? I mean, there is utility in that. So I think that's where it's going. And I think in the next 5-10 years, artificial intelligence is going to get to a point where, you can talk to Alexa in the language you're learning, and she, I guess, they will be able to, respond increasingly naturally. So I think it's an unstoppable train. And I think there's no turning it back. I mean, I may or may not follow the tide. I don't know. But I think that's where it's going. And the pace, it's an exponential curve, and the pace is quickening all the time.
Yeah, I love that thought, actually. Just on what you were saying there, actually, Ollie, it's interesting because I've been studying Kristang, which is a language spoken in Singapore and Malaysia, and we use Telegram as part of the chat for that, for the lesson. And there's a Kristang bot, and you write to the Kristang bot. You just write "Klai Fala," and that means like, how do you say, and then you put the word in English. And then it will tell you in Kristang what the word is. It's kind of a dictionary that just tells you the word, which I find quite cool. And that's I suppose older technology, but I'm imagining that now, if I can just go, hey, Kristang bot, klai fala cup. and then the Kristang bot just says, cup is copa or kopu, whatever it is.
So I was muted. I think what people should be, I think the really relevant factor is the pace of just how quickly this is going to develop, because if you think about the last 10 years, I mean, people have been talking about AI and bots for some time now, but it seems to me that there hasn't been a great deal of development from, say, 2010 to 2020.
Mm.
Things are pretty much as they were in terms of, like, AI has not really filtered through to mainstream culture yet. Even like Siri, like, it's limited use. It's like, Alexa, add this to the shopping list. Like, that's the extent of it, really. But I think that the pace is really quickening. So whatever, if you look at the last 10 years as a barometer, like, that's absolutely not the case. It's like the beginning of the hockey stick curve, and the next 10 years are gonna be 100 times what the previous 10 years were. So I think, I mean, hopefully we'll still be here having these conversations in 10 years time, but I think the landscape is going to be a totally different one. And, by that time we'll have self-driving cars. You know, big changes are coming. It's,
Yeah,
I'm on the one hand excited, and on the other hand, rather nervous.
I love it. You're turning into an old man, Ollie.
I
That's
know,
a good thing, isn't
totally,
it?
totally. I'm really I'm just like, you know what? I'm super nostalgic about the days when I would just, I mean, I remember learning Portuguese in London, and the only thing I would do twice a week, I'd go and meet my friend Luciana, and we'd go to a cafe down the street, and we would just sit there and talk Portuguese and English for a couple of hours, and oh, thank you. We talk Portuguese for a couple of hours, and I would kind of write everything down, and and um, and just chat, and like, that's pure joy for me. And I don't want anything different to that. So yeah, I'm probably going to just be sniping from the sidelines for the next.
It's funny that when you said about 2010 to now, and how the technology we were talking about always being sort of presented to us as this is the future, it's still funny that like 2021 and we're still not quite there with those kinds of promises. Virtual reality was one of the ones that I saw so many
Yeah, remember
presentations.
that?
Do you remember? And you'd see them, and then you look up and you see a tree and it says the name, and then you meet somebody and you use other people were in this world, and that's kind of not there yet either, is it?
Augmented reality as well. Remember that thing where you used to walk around with your smartphone and hold it up, and it would
Mm.
superimpose things on the top, and people had that Google Glass. Remember
Yeah,
that? In fact, I remember at one of
Benny.
the Benny,
Benny,
yeah,
Benny was wearing them. He's the first Google Glass, wasn't he?
yeah, at one, it must have been the Polyglot conference. That's right, Polyglot gathering, like 2015 or something. Benny gave a talk, and he had this Google Glass or someone, he won at a competition from some conference or something, and it was a massive buzz at the time. And everyone said, yeah, it's it's not quite there yet, but in a year from now, everyone's going to be walking around with these glasses. And for people who don't remember, a Google Glass was essentially a pair of glasses which would kind of read your environment, and then you'd be able to say, I don't know what they would do, like, where's the take me to the butcher's, and then you have this map superimposed onto your glasses, so you could just follow it without the need for a smartphone. And but yeah, it just didn't happen, did it? It just didn't materialize.
No, I think they're still around, but they're just not. It's not the commonplace item that you imagined it would be when you first saw it, because it looked pretty cool. I was imagining how on earth I'd be able to read anything, having to make things bigger already with my poor eyes. But it would have been. I thought it would have been a very interesting turn for society to have all this sort of thing coming on, like you saw in these films years ago, where sort of Terminator type thing, where the letters appear, on the screen, so you find out where people are.
What's your feeling about these instant translation earbuds that you just see everywhere being advertised?
Do you know, I watched Alex did made a video recently, I say recently, within the last couple of months, and he went and tested out one of these instant translation devices. And the crux of it, I mean, go and watch the video because it's interesting to watch in its own right. It should be on Alex Rollins' channel. But basically what he did is he went around Barcelona speaking English, and it would translate it into Spanish. Now, for things like in a cafe, I would like a coffee with milk and sugar. It would translate it perfectly well. For directions, it was a little bit more challenging, because he'd say, well, where is the nearest whatever? And then because people don't speak like a book and they're in a rush, they're on a street, it's a busy environment, there's noise around. It wasn't great at getting the instructions for how to get there. So you'd need to, first of all, find someone with a lot of patience to do it with you. And you possibly might. As they get more commonplace, I think you probably get fewer people being that patient because you get more and more people asking you to do it. And then also the way they pronounce some things or the way they said turn a phrase, if you see the sign for it gets very convoluted with directions when you're in a real context. And that didn't really work very well. And then for a normal conversation as well, like on a much deeper level, it wasn't really hitting the spot. It was mistranslating words. And I know people who have actually lived through at the moment relationships where they rely on this to sort of for their communication, and they have so many issues with arguments and things of the translation not being right, and it causes all sorts of issues.
What relationships rely on an instant translation?
Well, there are. So I've seen it before. I've seen it happen, and I've seen the fallout from that. So without naming and shaming people,
that sounds like a YouTube video in the making.
Well, probably is actually. People will be writing to me now, why don't you make a video about all that stuff? No, but seriously, there are people that meet in this way, and the communication doesn't get it across in the same way. Because then the other issue you've got if you're talking about a proper conversation is you're talking from your cultural context and you're not adapting to the new cultural context. Because learning a language isn't just about learning the words and translating them from one language to another. Learning a language and internalizing it is actually adapting to the culture, the norms, what kind of things you talk about, and then in turn, how people will react to what you're talking about.
Right, and you can imagine that for example, in Asian cultures where simple, like fundamental greetings and interactions in the West, like hello, yes, no, are not said, or calling people by their name, by pronouns like you are not used, right? So you can imagine the difficulty.
I'm imagining someone now, if you go up to someone and say anata in anata wa, and you talk about somebody like that in Japanese with anata, or it would be highly irregular.
Yeah. Although I suppose like people listening to the translation from a machine are going to be somewhat, they're not going to get offended by it, or they shouldn't.
No, but in a basic environment, maybe if you're buying something in a shop, but then how far really does that take you beyond that stage then to actually learn the language? I don't think we're anywhere near a place where we need to think not learning the language is now an option, unless you literally just want to go and buy coffee in a coffee shop and a few things, it's obvious what you want and you're using a translation device.
Yeah, I'm still quite staggered by the number of emails I get from people saying, Ollie, what is actually the point of learning a language now? Because you've got Google Translate, so in a few years it's going to be able to translate everything for me. Like, what's the point? And I don't really know how to answer that. If I need to answer that, if you're asking that question, you're probably not. I mean, I would still encourage you to do it, but you need to. You're going to have to, find a bit more interest in learning languages before you're likely to have much success. But you're right. I mean, it feels a long way off. It's like it feels a little bit like what virtual reality felt like 20 years ago, right? It's like here's this thing that's coming, but then look at VR, it just didn't really materialize, right? So who knows?
I think it's a nice way to finish, actually, just sort of dispelling that myth about sort of technology and how it's taken over language learning and the need for multilingualism in the world. I think the need for it and for the respect and mutual sort of understanding is actually probably greater than ever. So that we come together as societies, and you see more and more people moving around as well nowadays. So it's often plugging into a new community and learning about them can often be easier than it ever was, because there's a much more global mobility than there was before. So maybe we'll make a comeback with our workshops at some stage to sort of reignite that motivation.
Well, I think after the current drama, I would have thought that people would be craving that kind of intimate intimate environment. I know I am. So yeah, watch this space.
Yeah, that would be lovely. Thank you so much for joining me, Ollie,
Pleasure.
and celebrating multilingualism with us today. Always a pleasure to talk to you, and I'll speak to you again soon privately, obviously. But thank you for today, and thanks for sharing your stories and experience.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and yeah, at your service.
See you soon. See you, Ollie.
Cheers.
Bye bye.